Imagine this for a moment. A 10-year-old boy and his 7-year-old sister, barefoot and bleeding, crashing through the Appalachian wilderness. In the boy's arms is a crying infant. They are the only thing left of their family. Behind them, in the chilling silence that always follows the screams, lies the ruin of their home and the bodies of their father and their 7 brothers. How does a family get wiped from the face of the earth in a single afternoon, leaving only children to tell the tale? The history books call it the Hannon family massacre, just another bloody footnote in the story of the American frontier. But that simple label hides a far darker and more complex truth. It hides the story of a forgotten war, of a visionary warrior fighting for his people's survival, and of a clash of worlds so violent it left ghosts that are said to haunt these mountains to this very day. Today, we journey back to that brutal summer of 1776 to find out what really happened on the day hell descended into a quiet mountain hollow. Before the screams, there was the quiet rhythm of a life being carved out of the wilderness. William Hannon's homestead was little more than a notch in the vast green cloak of the North Carolina mountains. A log cabin, sturdy and rough-hewn, stood in a small clearing, a testament to endless hours of labor. Around it, a field of corn and beans fought a daily battle against the encroaching forest. This was the frontier in 1776, not a place of grand adventure, but of grueling, back-breaking work from sunup to sundown. The forest was both a provider and a threat. It gave them timber for their home, game for their table, and cool water from its creeks. But it also held its secrets in a deep, watchful silence. William Hannon was a man defined by that silence. A widower, he was the sole guardian of 10 children, a responsibility that would have crushed a lesser man. His 5 eldest sons were already turning into men themselves, their hands calloused from the axe and the plow. They worked beside their father in the fields, their shared sweat watering the very ground they hoped to one day call their own. They weren't invaders in their own minds. They were builders, planters, men chasing the simple, universal dream of leaving something behind for their children. Inside the cabin, life was a hum of smaller chores. 10-year-old Edwin was already learning the weight of responsibility, while his 7-year-old sister Winnie was more mother than child to the 2 toddlers and the new baby, Elizabeth. Their world was small, bounded by the edge of the woods and the arc of the sun. Their joys were simple: a cool drink of water after a hot day's work, the rare taste of wild honey, the stories told by the firelight as the mountains outside grew dark and quiet. It was a hard life, but it was their life, whole and unbroken. But the year was 1776, and while men in Philadelphia were debating the birth of a new nation, the world these settlers knew was on the verge of a violent, bloody death. The winds of revolution that blew through the cities reached the mountains as distorted whispers, rumors carried by traders and traveling preachers. They spoke of war with the British, of independence, of freedom, words that felt distant and abstract in a place where survival was the only law that mattered. The more immediate danger had a name that was beginning to be spoken with a mix of fear and reluctant respect: Dragging Canoe. He was the leader of the Chickamauga Cherokee, a man who refused to bow to the white tide. Whispers said he had sworn a blood oath to drive the settlers from his ancestral lands. The Hannon family, in their quiet hollow, knew of these rumors. Every snap of a twig in the forest, every unfamiliar shadow at dusk, was a reminder that their small patch of cleared land was an island in an ocean of ancient history they did not understand. They were living on borrowed time, and they had no idea the debt was about to be called due. The Hannons had no quarrel with their immediate neighbors. On the frontier, you relied on the folks in the next valley over. No, the grudges that doomed them were older, deeper, and written on the land itself. William Hannon and his family were living on the edge of a wound that had been festering for decades. Each treaty signed by distant chiefs, each parcel of land ceded under pressure, was another drop of poison in the well. To the Cherokee, the settlers' cabins weren't homes. They were markers of a slow, creeping death to their way of life. The architect of this simmering rage was Dragging Canoe. He was a man who saw the future in the tired eyes of the old chiefs who kept giving away land, hoping for a peace that never came. At a treaty meeting, as yet another swath of ancestral hunting ground was signed over, he pointed to the land and spoke words that would become a prophecy written in blood. "You have bought a beautiful land," he told the settlers, "but I am afraid that you will find its settlement dark and bloody." He saw no compromise, only oblivion. Dragging Canoe and his followers, the Chickamauga, were not just a band of renegades. They were the hardened soul of the Cherokee resistance. They saw the American Revolution not as a fight for freedom, but as a chaotic opportunity. British agents, eager to sow terror on the colonial frontier, fanned the flames of their fury. They provided guns, ammunition, and promises, turning the Chickamauga's righteous anger into a weapon. For Dragging Canoe, this wasn't about fighting for the British king. It was a holy war for the mountains themselves. This web of intrigue and old hatreds created an atmosphere thick with paranoia. In the scattered settlements, rumors spread like wildfire. A hunter would report seeing unfamiliar tracks by the creek. A trader would bring news of Chickamauga war parties gathering in the hidden valleys. Whispers turned to warnings, and warnings turned to cold, hard fear. The Hannon family, like every other settler, would have felt it. The friendly waves they might have once exchanged with Cherokee hunters were gone, replaced by wary, assessing stares across the trees. The air itself had changed. It was no longer just the quiet of the mountains. It was the tense, listening silence before a storm. The point of no return wasn't a shouted argument or a line drawn in the dirt. It was a silent decision made in the deep shadows of the forest. It was the moment a Chickamauga war party, their faces painted in the colors of vengeance, began to move with purpose toward the smell of wood smoke from the Hannon cabin. For them, this wasn't murder. It was surgery. It was cutting out a cancer that was killing their world, one small homestead at a time. Every snapped twig under their moccasins was a drumbeat of inevitability. On the other side of that thin veil of trees, life continued in blissful ignorance. It was a hot, heavy summer afternoon. William Hannon and his 5 oldest boys were in the field, likely bent over their work, their backs slick with sweat. The rhythmic thud of a hoe against the earth, the drone of insects in the thick air, these were the sounds of their world. Their rifles, the essential tools of frontier survival, were likely propped against a stump at the edge of the clearing. In the quiet rhythm of their labor, the danger that had been a whisper for months had faded to a dull background hum. This was the fatal miscalculation of the frontier, the belief that because the morning was peaceful, the afternoon would be too. The Hannon men were tired, focused on the soil, their senses lulled by the heat. They didn't see the flicker of movement in the tree line. They didn't hear the collective intake of breath as dozens of eyes fixed on them from the shadows. The war party had reached the edge of the woods. They could see the unsuspecting figures in the field, see the faint outline of the cabin beyond. There was no turning back now. The promise made to Dragging Canoe, the anger fueled by British guns, the generations of grief for lost lands, it all coalesced into this one irreversible moment. A hand was raised. A silent signal was given. The deep, listening silence of the Appalachian forest was about to be broken by a sound that would echo through generations. It began with a sound that didn't belong in a peaceful afternoon. It wasn't the call of a bird or the snap of a twig, but the chilling, high-pitched war cry of the Chickamauga erupting from the tree line. For William Hannon and his 5 sons, there was no time to run, no time to even turn and grab their rifles. The world of hoeing and planting vanished in an instant, replaced by a storm of motion and violence that swept over the field. It wasn't a battle. It was a harvest. Moments later, it was over. The rhythmic sounds of work had been replaced by a silence that was heavy and absolute. 6 men who had been toiling under the sun were now part of the very earth they had been turning. From the cabin, one could only see the aftermath, the still figures lying in the dirt and the attackers moving among them. One warrior stood over the body of William Hannon and with a swift, practiced motion raised a dark, bloody proof of his victory to the sky before disappearing back into the shadows of the forest. Inside the cabin, the screams from the field had been cut short, leaving a ringing void that was even more terrifying. 10-year-old Edwin and 7-year-old Winnie huddled together, trying to quiet the 2 toddlers and the crying infant, Elizabeth. Then came a new sound, the splintering of their own front door. It burst inward, and the small, dim cabin was suddenly filled with huge, terrifying shadows. The air grew thick with the scent of sweat, rage, and something metallic that the children didn't understand. The warriors' eyes, accustomed to the dim light of the forest, scanned the cabin. They saw the children. In the merciless logic of a war for survival, these were not children. They were the seeds of their enemy, seeds that could not be allowed to grow. One of the warriors moved toward the 3-year-old boy, who was crying in terror. There was a small, sharp scream, followed by a sickeningly dull thud against the log wall, and then silence. The newborn, Elizabeth, began to wail, her infant cries filling the cabin. Another warrior moved toward her. But in that moment, in that bloody, chaotic frenzy, something happened. Perhaps the warriors were spooked by a sound. Perhaps they believed their work was done and were eager to leave. For one critical second, their attention was diverted. It was all the time the universe would give. It wasn't a thought, but a pure animal instinct that moved 10-year-old Edwin. As the warrior turned away, the boy lunged, scooping the screaming infant from her cradle. He grabbed Winnie's hand, pulling her with a force she didn't know he possessed. He didn't look back at the small, still form of his little brother. He didn't look at anything but the gaping hole where the door used to be. They slipped out of the cabin like 2 small ghosts, leaving their own grave. Barefoot, with a screaming baby in their arms, they ran. They didn't run toward the fields where their father lay. They ran for the one place that had always seemed so dark and threatening, the only place that now offered salvation, the deep, silent woods. They plunged into the shadows, the thorny branches tearing at their skin, running from the silence that had just fallen over their home, a silence now more terrifying than any scream. For what felt like an eternity, Edwin and Winnie ran, fueled by a terror that numbed the pain of thorns and sharp rocks under their bare feet. The only reality was the weight of the baby in Edwin's arms and the desperate, ragged sound of their own breathing. They finally stumbled out of the tree line and into the clearing of the nearest farmstead, collapsing in a heap of exhaustion and shock. They were a horrifying sight. 2 children covered in scratches, their eyes wide with a horror no words could yet explain, and a wailing infant. But the message they brought didn't need words. It was carried in their silence and their tears. Within the hour, a grim-faced party of neighbors, rifles in hand, made their way cautiously toward the Hannon homestead. The first thing they noticed was the silence. The familiar sounds of a working farm, the chop of an axe, the call of a voice were gone. All they could hear was the buzzing of flies in the oppressive summer heat. They found William and his sons in the field, lying where they had fallen, the earth around them stained a dark, terrible color. The scene spoke of a swift, merciless violence that left no room for a fight. The men's faces hardened as they approached the cabin. The door hung broken on its hinges, a gaping wound in the side of the small home. Inside was a scene of profound violation. The simple furniture was overturned, and in the dim light they saw what the children had fled from: the overturned cradle, the small, still body of the 3-year-old boy. It was a sight that burned itself into the minds of even the most hardened frontiersmen, turning their fear into a cold, diamond-hard rage. The surviving children were taken in, passed from one set of gentle, grieving hands to another. But they were no longer the children they had been that morning. They were ghosts, haunted by what they had seen and heard. Winnie clung to the infant Elizabeth as if the baby were the last anchor in a world that had been washed away by a flood of violence. Edwin, the 10-year-old boy who had saved them, retreated into a silent, watchful place deep within himself. His eyes held the look of a man who had stared into the abyss and had seen the abyss stare back. The news of the massacre traveled like a shockwave through the scattered settlements of the North Carolina frontier. It was a story told in hushed, terrified whispers around hearths that night. Doors were barred, rifles were loaded, and every shadow in the woods became a source of terror. The fragile illusion of safety was shattered. Dragging Canoe was no longer a distant rumor. He was a tangible, blood-soaked threat who had reached into their world and ripped a family apart. Fear was the first reaction. But in the heart of the Appalachian settler, fear was always followed by something else, a burning, unquenchable thirst for vengeance. The hunt began not with a sheriff's decree, but with a low growl of fury that rippled through the scattered cabins. As the bodies of the Hannons were being prepared for their final rest in the hard Appalachian soil, the men of the frontier were gathering. They came with their long rifles, powder horns, and a quiet, murderous resolve in their eyes. These weren't lawmen. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and trappers whose hands were as accustomed to an axe handle as a trigger. The massacre wasn't an attack on a stranger. It was an attack on every single one of them, on their wives, their children, their own precarious existence. They formed a ragged posse, a grim collection of about 20 men, and plunged into the forest on the trail of the war party. They were skilled woodsmen, men who could read a bent twig or a scuffed patch of moss like a page in a book. But the mountains that had been their home now became an alien landscape, a deadly labyrinth that belonged to their enemy. Every ravine could hide an ambush, every thicket of rhododendron a sniper. The air, thick with humidity, was also thick with a palpable tension that made the sweat on their necks run cold. For days, they pushed deeper into the wilderness, their initial rage sharpening into a focused, exhausting pursuit. They found signs of the war party's passage, the remains of a hastily eaten meal, a single dropped feather from a ceremonial dress, a faint moccasin print in the mud of a creek bed. Each discovery sent a jolt of adrenaline through the weary men, pulling them onward. They were close. They could feel it. They slept in shifts, their rifles never leaving their hands, their dreams filled with shadows and the ghost of a child's scream. But the Chickamauga were masters of this domain. They moved like smoke through the trees, their trail growing fainter and more confusing with every mile. The posse would follow a clear path for hours, only to have it vanish completely on a rocky ridge, as if the warriors had simply been lifted into the sky. The mountains were helping their own. The forest that had provided the Hannons with life was now actively shielding their killers, swallowing them into its vast green depths. The moment of capture never came. After a week of relentless pursuit, the posse stood on a high bluff, looking out over an endless expanse of ridges and valleys. They were gaunt, their supplies were dwindling, and their tracks were the only ones they had seen for 2 days. The grim truth settled upon them like a shroud. The war party had dissolved back into the wilderness, swallowed by a network of hidden paths and sympathetic villages they could never hope to find. There was no fierce firefight, no exhausted surrender. There was only the cold, bitter realization that the men they were hunting were gone. They had struck and then vanished, leaving nothing behind but corpses and terror. The posse returned to their homesteads, not with prisoners, but with a new, chilling certainty. The war had just begun, and the enemy was a ghost they could not catch. There was no trial, no courtroom, no judge in a black robe, no clever lawyers arguing points of law. To expect such things would be to misunderstand the brutal reality of the frontier in 1776. The courthouses of the new nation were far away, beyond the mountains, and their laws felt as distant and irrelevant as the king across the sea. The men who killed the Hannons were never arrested, never identified, never brought before a jury of their peers. They were simply phantoms who had emerged from the forest and returned to it. The only verdict delivered was the one declared in the hearts of the settlers. The war party that had attacked the Hannons was, in their eyes, guilty beyond any doubt. The evidence was not in testimony, but in the freshly turned earth of 9 graves on a hillside. The sentence was not imprisonment, but death. Death not just to the specific warriors who had wielded the hatchets, but to the entire idea of a shared land. The massacre became a justification, a rallying cry that hardened hearts and erased any lingering thoughts of peaceful coexistence. In the place of a formal trial, there was a trial by rumor and fire. The name of Dragging Canoe became a curse, a name synonymous with savagery and evil. Any Cherokee, whether they followed Dragging Canoe or the peace-seeking chiefs, was now viewed with suspicion and hatred. The act of a single war party was laid at the feet of an entire people. This was the justice of the mountains, swift, absolute, and unforgiving. It wasn't about finding individual culprits, it was about identifying an enemy. The lack of a formal verdict was, in its own way, the most damning verdict of all. It signified that the Hannon family lived and died in a place where the rule of law had not yet taken root. Their lives were governed by a more ancient and brutal code, the code of survival and retribution. The failure of the posse to capture the killers meant there would be no clean resolution, no moment of state-sanctioned justice to close the wound. Instead, the wound was left to fester. It fueled a cycle of retaliatory raids and counter-raids that would stain the Appalachian soil with blood for another 2 decades. A brutal, undeclared war where every man was his own judge, jury, and executioner. What became of the children who ran from a cabin of ghosts? They survived, but they never truly escaped that summer afternoon. They grew up in the shadow of that day, carrying a silence that others could not understand. Legends in these mountains say that Edwin, the boy who had to become a man in a matter of seconds, grew into a hard, quiet frontiersman whose eyes were always scanning the tree line. He was a man forever at war with the memory of what he had lost. Winnie and Elizabeth, the sister and the infant she helped save, grew to become wives and mothers themselves. They built new families, and their bloodline continues to this day, woven into the fabric of Appalachia. But those who knew them said there was always a sadness that never quite left their eyes, a memory of a lullaby that ended in a scream. If you were to go looking for the Hannon homestead today, you wouldn't find it. There is no preserved cabin, no historical marker by the side of the road. The forest has long since swallowed the scar of their small field. The logs of their home have rotted back into the earth from which they came. The only physical trace left is the land itself, and perhaps a few unmarked stones on a forgotten hillside, worn smooth by 2 centuries of rain and wind. But the story did not rot away with the cabin walls. It seeped into the soil like blood, becoming a part of the local folklore. For generations, people living in that hollow have spoken of strange things. They say that on quiet, moonless summer nights, if you stand near the creek where the homestead was, you can sometimes hear the faint, ghostly sound of a baby crying on the wind. It is the soul of the murdered infant, they say, forever lost between worlds. Most people have forgotten the name William Hannon. The official histories mention the event only in passing, if at all. But the mountains remember. The old oaks that witnessed the attack still stand, their rings holding the memory of that day's terrible silence. The story isn't in a book, it's in the land itself. It's a ghost story whispered to children to keep them close to home after dark, a cautionary tale about the brutal cost of a new nation. The paper may have forgotten, but the earth never does. So we return to the question that haunted us from the beginning. How does a family get wiped from the face of the earth, leaving only children to tell the tale? The easy answer is to blame the savagery of the frontier, to point a finger at Dragging Canoe and his warriors. But the truth, like the Appalachian forest itself, is a place of deep and tangled shadows. The Hannon family weren't just killed by men with hatchets. They were caught in the grinding gears of history, crushed between one people's desperate dream for a new life and another people's even more desperate struggle to save their ancient world from disappearing forever. This story is not just an account of a brutal massacre. It is a parable of how America was born. For every noble word written in the Declaration of Independence that summer, there was a silent, bloody chapter being written in a forgotten mountain hollow. It reminds us that progress is never clean, and the foundations of a new world are often laid upon the graves of the old one. The Hannons were pioneers, but they were also trespassers. The Chickamauga were defenders of their homeland, but they were also the agents of a nightmare. There are no simple heroes or villains here. There are only human beings pushed to the limits of their endurance, their fear, and their fury. The real legacy of this tragedy isn't just the ghost of a crying baby on the wind. It's in the resilience of those who survived, the children who ran from hell and somehow managed to build new lives. It is a story not just of cruelty, but of the unyielding strength of the human spirit. It is a wound on the soul of Appalachia that has never fully healed, a quiet reminder that the land we walk on is layered with stories, sorrows, and blood we have long since forgotten. The mountains hold these memories, locked away in their silent, stony heart. They remember the laughter of children in a sunlit field, the chilling war cry that shattered the peace, and the terrible silence that followed. And now, my friends, so do you.